The title in the program says PED Lessons Learned in Preparation for the Next Event. My title's got a big question mark. PED Lessons Learned with a big question mark. And I'm going to talk about lessons we've learned so far, because this is an ongoing deal. May of last year, so we aren't 12 months into this thing yet, and we're still learning a lot of lessons. I want to go over these pieces about some of the insights on lessons that have been learned, and this is more from my perspective than anything as an official report. In December of last year, the industry, the NPPC, AASV, the Pork Board, sat down with USDA in Washington. And the objective of that meeting was to talk about lessons learned from PED and what we need to do in order to do better next time. This isn't a report from that. It has some of those things in there, but as I said, we've learned a lot of lessons, or we're learning a lot of lessons since December from this now. So it's an ongoing deal. And I'm going to give you some perspectives about each one of these things as potential lessons or things that we're learning. And the whole process, I've got PED Strategic Task Force. We formed this group that tries to give some direction and some oversight to the industry and government and allied industry and diagnostic labs, and all of us working together to try to figure out PED and what we should be doing. And so that's the Strategic Task Force. But what it's got on there in the list is really the players in this thing. And the lessons learned are pieces from each one of those players, each one of those stakeholders in PED. And also, I'll also say that as we look at lessons learned or things we're learning for the next disease, as it says in the program, from the way that we look at this in the Strategic Task Force and from the bigger picture, this isn't really a pork industry issue. This is an animal agriculture issue. And it's not pork specific. We learn a lot of lessons from PED, but I'm telling you, it's not just a pork deal. The lessons that we're learning about all of these issues that I'll just simply highlight in half an hour. I can only highlight some things. Apply to more than just pigs. I put this one up first because this is probably one of the spots where we need to make the most progress. The ability for our diagnostic labs to share data in a secure manner, and that's not confidential manner, but that's a secure manner because confidentiality implies that it's not shareable. But it's got to be secured in order to protect it from uses that it's not intended for. So we've got to develop a way in order for this data to be secured so it can be available for analysis. Again, not a pork issue, or not just a pork issue, but a multi-species issue. One of the things that we learned very early on in this is the need for better data to be analyzed, to be available to be analyzed, and that includes premises identification on VDL submission forms. Where on a submission form, the owner may be an address in downtown Des Moines or downtown Minneapolis, that doesn't give you any information about where these animals are or anything about the animals. So the need for premises identification on a diagnostic lab submission form is a big lesson learned, is a very big lesson learned, but that's not the only piece. The veterinary diagnostic labs tell us that they can't use that information, they can't share that information unless they have permission to share that information from the submitter. So it's not simply a matter of putting a line on a submission form and filling it out, but there's also other steps that have to happen. We've got to figure that out, because surveillance by permission in emerging diseases is a hindrance to understanding what's happening. So we've got to figure that out. One of the things, it's fairly well in focus, one of the things that illustrates all of this is Dane Goody's and Dr. Bob Morrison's project at the University of Minnesota, in which they have, I think it's 15 production companies that cooperate, 680 breeding herds, 2.5 million sows in these 680 breeding herds that have agreed to share their disease information. This is outside of the veterinary diagnostic lab NIAA system. This is an agreement among these companies that it's in our best interest to know what everybody else is doing, so we're going to share this information within our group. And their data is available. And the thing that happens then is you can take a look at their data, and early on in the outbreak, and you can't see the numbers here, but early on in the outbreak in the summer, this Oklahoma panhandle is this first line, this red line, the Oklahoma panhandle outbreak, and that happened very quickly, and it spread through Oklahoma like wildfire. It wasn't at that time affecting multiple states. There were multiple states involved, but not the way it is now. Added to that is Southeast U.S. in the green line, and added to that is the blue line in the Midwest. This type of information is not available through the NIAA system with USDA because of a lack of the ability to share that kind of data. And it's not NIAA's fault. It's not USDA's fault on that. It's the way the system's built. If we're going to do a better job of preparing for the next disease, we have to have good data for good epidemiologists to figure out what's going on. And this is another look at that data that gives us the look at this is the early outbreak in the summer in Oklahoma. The rest of the summer was relatively quiet, getting into November and getting into February here. We don't have that type of data because what we've got from the veterinary diagnostic labs going into being reported now on the ASV website is weekly information based on spreadsheets that are hand put together, and that doesn't have premises identification. So as we've gone through the outbreak, it's become so convoluted and the data is so hidden that there isn't any way to take it out. One of the most important lessons that we've learned is the need for good data to be able to be available for analysis. The next one, this one's kind of scary because this one, the biosecurity lessons we've learned, is really an illustration of what you don't know. You got to know what you don't know, and boy, are we finding out a lot of things that we don't know. And one of them was the roles of the role of packing plants, the roles of points of concentration. For all of our careers, everybody knows that you go into a packing plant, you're probably going to carry something back out again. But we didn't have any data to show that. It's pretty much just intuition. But what we didn't really know is how this works with PED and enteric viruses. It's another lesson that we've learned. And Dr. Jim Lowe, Joe Connor, Paul Yeske spearheaded a survey of packing plants where they checked, they did a PCR Swiffer test, took samples from trucks coming into the plant, then took samples of trucks going out of the plant. And what they found was that for every contaminated truck that went in, and this was done last summer, this wasn't done in February, And so that might be another lesson that we could learn. But it was done last summer when remember that graph where that line was rather low. What they found was that for every truck that came in, 0.7, or rounding up, another contaminated truck went out. So for every contaminated truck that went in, 2 went out, including that one that initially came in. And that's because of the sufficient to allow PED movement between trailers, all of the driver interaction, and all of the things that go on with the packing plants, and the issues with fatigued pigs and taking them off of trailers, and people unloading, going back and forth. What we found is that our intuition was correct, and that's a big risk. And trying to figure that out and how to affect that in the packing plant is an extremely important lesson learned, because that's going to affect everything else that we have. We get CSF, we get FMD, we get anything else, multi-species wise, the same issue is going to come up, and we've got to address it. And finally, the more contact between the trailer and the plant's associated with higher rate of PED spread. Okay, that was good, but again, it confirms the intuition of what we know. We're learning things. The scary part is we're learning how much we don't know. The other thing that we found out was that our biosecurity as an industry wasn't nearly as good as what we assumed it was, because everybody's got biosecurity, but it's not really biosecure. We've got biosecurity SOPs, but we aren't as biosecure as we thought we were. That was an important lesson as well. And with the help of a number of good people, that university practitioners, otherwise, that helped us put together guidelines on a lot of issues, and I'll show some of them. Transportation was the headline. Guidelines on a number of issues, because we didn't have research to back up a lot of this. We had to go by intuition and what is the best recommendations we could do for producers and veterinarians right now, even though we might not have things validated and verified through research and transmission routes. What do we think we know? What's the best thing that we can do right now? Transportation is the headline. This one was an example. That task force was on a telephone call, and they said, one of the topics was brought up is, it's about time for producers to start pumping pits and applying manure. And that was another thing. Well, shoot, we don't have any guidelines on that. We don't have any direction on that. Within a week, the extension people that are experts in this, within a week, they had this thing authored, and we had it out based on that input. Those are the types of lessons. The urgency lesson is probably one of the biggest ones that we learned from this. We don't have time to do the regular route of everything that happens. One of the things we've learned from PED is we have to act, and we have to act quickly, get the best information we've got, and try to help people. Epidemiology and transmission of this virus and of others is another lesson that we've learned, or we're learning, I think is the best way to put it. One of the things that we've done with that strategic task force is put together what we term rapid response teams. And with the help of USDA, the funding of USDA through a cooperative agreement, when we get word of, and this is by word of mouth, but when we get word of an epidemiologically distinct outbreak, one that doesn't make any sense, that you can't easily track where, well, that was associated with this, so it was associated with that, and so that now we know, well, that's probably what happened. We can't track all of these things, but where we get an outbreak that is what we in the task force term deemed to be epidemiologically distinct, we send a rapid response team out. And the rapid response team, as rapid as possible, response team out includes a USDA epidemiologist, includes a veterinarian investigator, a second set of eyes, and the practitioner for the herd, the owner and the practitioner. to go out and take a look at what's happened, try to figure out the routes, possible routes of introduction, take additional samples if needed, do additional diagnostic work if needed, but write up reports about what do we know about this herd versus that herd and how it's worked. This was an example of just a summary of rapid response team in Illinois where they looked at the air possibility of air spread of people, of vehicles, pigs, water, feed, and bedding materials. And they came up with their assessment of the probability of this happening of these things being a factor in those herds. Another one in Ohio, similar thing. And what you see in both of these is that when these things come back, and with the Canadian experience, that it continues to give us a question about the role of feed and feed products, a possible role of feed and feed products in the transmission of PED. So, a couple of weeks ago, we put together a group of nutritionists, of feed associations, feed companies, veterinarians, USDA, epidemiologists, FDA. We're all in the room together, 60 or some people in a room together, and we talked about what's this potential role of feed. We talked about Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Canada, and heard also what the feed industry is doing as far as mitigation or their own investigations. And at the end of the day, and with everybody's agreement and everybody's cooperation within that meeting, we talked about what we know. What do we know about feed and PED? And this is the start of the list. So we start out, of course, with this no food safety issue, impacting various sizes and production types. PCR is an important tool, but also what we need to know is we need to know how to validate PCR results. I didn't put that in there anywhere, but PCR is an important tool, but it'll only detect the viral RNA. It won't detect viability. This one is probably our best summary statement of that meeting. And there are more, but this one's especially interesting. Multiple methods of transmission, environmental, transportation, feed systems, and other vectors. And we did that purposefully. We didn't say feed. We didn't say feed or feed products, but we said feed systems. And the reason they said feed systems is because the feed system includes from the raw materials all the way to the bin on the farm. And so there's an opportunity for viral contamination at multiple steps. It's not just PED. Again, this can be not just a pork issue, a pig issue. There's an opportunity for viral contamination or contamination of feed stuffs in a number of steps. The ingredients, the raw ingredients, through the processing process, and post-processing contamination. We've got to figure that out, because if these epidemiologically distinct outbreaks or cases are feed-related, we've got to figure this out in order to be able to mitigate that. We've got to figure this out to be able to help. We've put together, and with the cooperation of the American Feed Industry Association, National Grain and Feeds Association, the National Renderers Association, the Porcine Plasma, or the Plasma Producers Associations, this consortium or this collaboration for research. Very important piece here, and it's something that we're learning as we go. Other things that we came out of that meeting with was this issue of time by temperature should be effective in inactivating the virus. This is an area of further research that we have to do. Post-processing contamination, I mentioned that. And one of the points, one of the objectives of this meeting was to give us a research approach to attack PED so we better understand, and we've got some data behind the risks or risk assessments that's needed for the feed relationship with PED or any viral transmission. Another lesson that we're learning. We haven't learned, but it's certainly one that we're learning. This is another one that we're in the process of learning. The immunity and the environmental viral load. University of Minnesota, early on in this thing, told us about the concentration of the virus that's coming out of the pigs that are infected, the small pigs that are infected. 1 gram of feces, not 1 gram of virus, but 1 gram of feces from an infected pig into 100 square meters of water given back to pigs would make those pigs, it's concentrated enough that they surmise that that would be infective to other pigs. That means you put about the size of an eraser on the end of a pencil into 24,600 gallons of water and feed that water back to pigs, and it will infect them with PED. The lesson that we're learning out of this, I believe, is that we're learning about a disease, the concentration of which I don't think we've ever had any experience with. This is not TGE. This is a viral concentration that is new, and as we talk about, as we go through the research that needs to happen in order to learn more lessons about this, one of the issues that we've got is this issue of sow immunity and feedback protocols, duration, and it comes back to immunity and viral load, viral exposure. And the question becomes, you can overwhelm immunity. The question is, how do we adjust this? How do we affect this in order to allow the immunity in our sow herds to be effective enough to clean up? The reports are that about 70% of our sow herds are cleaning up. About 30 have continued exposure and continued problems, 30%, somewhere around there at this point. And it may be related to their ability and effectiveness of cleaning up the virus after infection, rather than that allows a continual exposure. But we had a lot of research priorities. We had to start from the very beginning with basic pathogenesis of PED, diagnostic tests, environmental stability, epidemiology, sow immunity. These are lessons we're still learning. These lessons certainly are pig specific, but the viral load and the relationship to the viral load and the environment is something that we have to pay, any species has to pay attention to. I put this under here is because of this environmental issue and immunity and all of the things that we've learned, lines of separation, exhibitors, what to do if you have a positive breeding herd, what you do if you have a positive nursery grow finish herd. We put all of these things up on the AASV link and the pork.org website, so they're all available online and can be found. Finally, one of the things that we're learning is this issue of urgency. You can't be comfortable or complacent. You can't do things the way you've always done them. And we're also investigating, and I'll talk about a forum resolution, industry and government roles and responsibilities. Usually our research process, by the time when we do a call for proposals, it's usually about a 4-month or so process from the call for proposals until we get them reviewed and go back and through selection and get contracts signed, and the research starts. And then we have a year contract. Generally, we'll have a year contract for the research to happen. When our first call for proposals in June, we did the call, we did the proposal, we did the reviews, we did the funding, and we did the contracts in 13 days. You can't do things the way the lesson is when you get something like this. You can't do things the way that you've always done them. You've got to do things differently. We've found that we've got at least 4 new viruses of Chinese Southeast Asia origin, not necessarily how they got into the country, but Chinese Southeast Asia origin in our swine herd in the last 18 to 24 months. And we've got to figure that out. that's an urgent issue, that's an urgent matter, and it leads to the roles and responsibilities because these are all non-reportable on a federal level, non-reportable, non-regulatory diseases on a federal level. There are some states that they are reportable, but they're non-regulatory diseases, as FMD or CSF, those would be. So we just had our annual Pork Industry Forum, the 1st of March, and the National Pork Producers Council had this resolution by which they asked for a listing of non-reportable swine diseases not in the United States. And this listing will end up being a matrix. What we'll do is on the x-axis put all the viruses, all the pathogens we know of, probably focusing on Asia and Southeast Asia and China first. On the y-axis, we'll put our diagnostic capabilities, ELISA, PCR, etc., diagnostic capabilities, maybe economic impact, some assessment, so we can prioritize this. And then we'll have a matrix by which we will be able to identify, here's a virus, we don't have any ELISA for this one. We got a PCR, but we don't have an ELISA, or what else do we need for diagnostic tests, for example? Because that was a lesson from PED. Back in May, we had no good diagnostic test to deal with this thing. It took us a couple of months to figure that out first, and that's a lesson that it put us a few months behind. So we're gonna look at what's likely to come next and see how capable we are to be able to handle it. We're going to also, another project is to get with government, both federal and state, and industry, everybody together, and talk about a response plan for the next PED. That's one of the biggest lessons learned. We need to have a better response plan for non-regulatory disease, one in which USDA does not have regulatory control. It's an industry issue. We've got to deal with it, but we, the collective we, industry, state, and federal, have to deal with it together. And that's one of our biggest lessons. We're going to work on that over the summer and try to develop a framework by which we can have the state federal industry response plan for the next PED or the next disease like that comes. Coordinated strategies to respond and contain or manage the disease is in relation to that. It's related to that. This strategy for efficient sharing of information deemed necessary for containment and control, that relates back to the first one that I talked about, and being able to gather the data, being able to compile it, to analyze it, and to report. And as we've gone through the issues of comprehensive surveillance, and we talked about that in multiple places, USAHA, NIAA, and a lot of other spots, there's been a lot of talk historically about confidentiality of data. And I submit that we're past confidentiality of data. We've got to get to security of data. And the strategies to be able to do that depends on our ability to have that data secure. And then finally, the strategies to strengthen the defense of the U.S. pork industry. And of course, this is pork-centric, but this isn't just pork. This, again, is a multi-species issue. That if we can get these coronaviruses in, if we can get these viruses in to the country in whatever manner they're coming in, every other species is also vulnerable to routes of introduction. And if these things are coming in, my real worry is what's coming after them besides. Not only what's the next one, but what could come after them as far as a foreign animal disease and what that can do to our trade. So those are lessons that I've learned that we have to act on in order to do a better job.